to introduce Ravi Ravindra. When I heard he was coming, I saw on the poster for the Totnes Consciousness Cafe that he'd been at the Advanced Studies Institute in Princeton as a physicist, and I was completely amazed that anyone from there should visit Schumacher College. But not content with this, Ravi then went into philosophy and was for many years professor in philosophy. And then, tired with people sharpening their pencils, but for no motive other than having sharp pencils, he went into, became professor of religion, comparative religion, and he's now emeritus professor of religion and of physics at Dalhousie University in Halifax. And he's written many books, which I can recommend, and he's been fantastic having him here this week in the course. So Ravi will speak for an hour, and then we'll be having time for questions, and after that we'll be having chai in the dining room. So over to you, Ravi.
Thank you. Don't hold any of this against me. I was actually wondering what to begin with. So I thought maybe I'll begin with one of our modern psalms. When I consider the heavens, the work of our equations, the black holes and the white dwarfs that we have ordained, what is God that we are mindful of Him? Some of you would no doubt immediately recognize that this is a rather bad rendering of the classical psalm, Psalm 8.
I'm sorry, can you speak up or turn the microphone on, please?
Well, really, whenever human beings have contemplated the heavens, they're always struck by its grandeur, splendor, as well as the vastness. Even in ancient times, when they may not have had the notions of the galaxies or anything outside our solar system, but the vastness of the universe has always been striking people, because relative to our human scale, even from here to the moon is very vast. So the vastness of the universe, as well as then their relative smallness, has always evoked questions. What is man that thou art mindful of him? In our days, the situation has slightly turned. This is the reason I started with the slight modern rendering of this psalm, that when we consider the heavens, the work of our equations, the black holes and the white dwarfs that we have ordained, what is God that we are mindful of him? The reasons for bringing this is that we are really very much in the scientific mindset, and really, in fact, practically dragooned by, especially in the name of quantum mechanics, anything can be said and it just, one is obliged to somehow accept it. And I just wish to raise some questions about all this. There is no reason for us to be so intimidated by this one of the many human activities. What has happened, particularly in the more or less the middle of the 20th century or slightly earlier than that, we have had very strong schools of philosophy. It's usually not so much the scientists themselves who convey the dogmatic qualities of science. It's usually people who are really not in the sciences, and they're commenting about science, and they are the ones who are awed by it. So we had a whole school of philosophy, the Vienna school or the positivist school of philosophy, really declaring that non-science is nonsense. And that whole background has very strongly affected our mindset. For many years, I had offices both in the religion department as well as in the physics department, and it was quite amazing to me. I would actually sometimes play this as a party game. If I introduced myself in a party that I was a professor of physics, right away people would have a kind of a posture of humility, and they will ask me what the latest discoveries about the black holes and the white dwarfs. This is how I came up with this little psalm. And if I ever said that I'm a professor of religion, they will tell me what religion is. Nobody ever asked what religion is. What has happened is a very strange situation. We just believe that anybody can speak about the Buddha or Christ or really behave like one if they wish, but they can't pretend to know physics or cosmology or quantum mechanics. There we listen. There are, throughout human history, people have been occupied, and it is always only a few people. We should always keep this in mind. Vast majority of people, every epoch in history, including now, are driven by sheer contingencies and necessities of life. It is a luxury to consider this kind of gathering, to think about philosophical, scientific, religious questions. If we bear this in mind, then we would also realize that throughout human history, there have been people interested in whatever we may call science. That is not always following the post-Galilean modern scientific methodology. That has been a development in science. In fact, modern science is really quite distinct from pre-modern or medieval European science or Chinese science or Indian science. There are fundamental differences. Nevertheless, in one form or the other, science has been done. Technology has been there. After all, whosoever invented the wheel, really, it's not altogether easy to start comparing with that kind of a massive revolution. So, similarly, spiritual search or interest or aspiration has been, as far as we can determine, also been a human concern throughout human history. So we don't need to decide that one of them must survive, the other should be done away with, that one is just fundamentally wrong or right. I think we can have a point of view that both of these are required. They fill certain human needs. The issue often arises about the truth in these subjects. Actually, I might as well remind you of a quote of Einstein, a part of which is probably better known, which is that science without religion is lame and religion without science is blind. This is Einstein, not a negligible scientist. But the second part of it, or the continuation of that, is often not reported, which is, whosoever does not consider the truth in religion and truth in science is as good as dead. So since we don't want to be considered dead by Einstein, we'll try to consider both of these things. Both of these enterprises are really concerned with nature. One with external nature, the other one with internal nature. Whenever people have turned even momentarily inward and have had a look, they can see. I'd be happy if you even right now turned inwardly, just see. Even a few fleeting moments of observation will show you that internally there is almost a constant state of apprehension or anxiety or worry, as if this is the psychological analog of the Brownian motion in matter. And people have therefore, throughout human history, wished to see if there can be a coherence and order in our internal nature. There have been many attempts positing a soul which somehow remains untouched or unsullied by all of these emotional or psychic disturbances, etc. I don't want to go into the history of various religious attempts at this, but I'm more interested in inviting each one of us to just have an occasional look inside. And there is not a single person alive, that at least I have ever spoken to, who does not occasionally wonder, what happens when I die? What is the meaning of my existence? None of us is going to live more than 70, 80, 90, 100 years. What happens then? Is it just, as Shakespeare says in one of his plays, just sound and fury signifying nothing? It is difficult for most human beings to convince themselves, in spite of all our scientific enterprise trying to convince them, that their life is really entirely purposeless and meaningless, just an accidental accretion of certain amoeba coming together, creating you. Nobody feels entirely satisfied by this diagnosis of themselves. So, search for meaning is one of the fundamental requirements or needs of our soul. I say soul because the body has other requirements: shelter, sex, food, all that. But the moment we consider slightly finer needs, so we now use the word soul. I don't mean to convey anything particularly definite by this. That will be an error. Because some budding scientist is then going to say, how can we measure the weight of the soul or something like this, which they made attempts to actually do this. Because there is always this misplaced concreteness category. Whenever we speak either literal-mindedly or trying to understand spiritual realities as if we could measure them by our usual balances or take photographs of them, and then people are saying, well, look, we sent man to the moon, they didn't meet angels there, so angels don't exist. Which is to say, all this is taking spiritual realities materialistically. It's equally true for those people who interpret the scriptures literal-mindedly. That's what they're doing also. But when one begins to see that within oneself there is this need for meaning, what is the meaning of my life? Other words get used. This is not the exclusive word. For example, the purpose. What is the purpose of my existence? And not only mine alone, but of whole humanity, whole creation. Is it just accidental? It is possible, but that is not very helpful for a sane living, for anybody. Similarly, clearly, we have need for knowledge. Aristotle's metaphysics actually begins with the opening sentence. Human beings are born with a need for knowledge. So we have these two needs. And one of them essentially has been occupied, not necessarily that it has to be, but it has been largely occupied with investigating external nature. And therefore it's useful for us to know what is it that science is trying to do. It's looking at the phenomena, all sorts of phenomena, which could also be internal, by which I mean, for example, somebody could take my blood out of me and investigate this, or somebody could even devise methods and means by which they could investigate what is going on in my brain, what sort of reactions are going on, or even what kind of images are going on. But that looking, that investigation is external. The word external here is important to emphasize. The material may be inside me. We're not talking about the location here. We're talking about the method of investigation. That method is by distancing the investigator from what is being investigated, by separating the two. Whereas all spiritual concern is, first of all, largely concerned with internal nature, as I said earlier. They are not uninterested in the cosmos. Everybody, this is the most obvious part, that everybody can see the obvious. But the other one immediately becomes much more difficult, partly because it becomes somewhat private affair, as if I have privileged access to my own interior, just as each one of us does to their own interior. But the approach there of investigation is an internal one, by which I don't mean just looking at things internally. One could also look at outside things. One could look at a tree, a cat, or another person, but as it were from the inside. This is a very different kind of enterprise. As if one could see a cat with cat's own eyes. So, seeing internally or externally, or knowing internally or externally, are not a matter of location. It is a matter of way of approaching. Knowing something internally is by participation, by union, by merging. All great classics of spirituality in any tradition whatsoever speak about precisely this kind of knowing. And these are, of course, illustrated more primarily or strongly by the mystical experiences, in which the so-called knower and whatever is known come together, merge into one. This is the so-called supreme identity. This is particularly emphasized in the Indian tradition, just partly because of the whole style of expression, but it is not missing in the Abrahamic spiritual traditions, often in the monastic tradition. Anybody who would read, for example, the Theologia Germanica or the Cloud of Unknowing or the Philokalia would immediately recognize this, or John of the Cross as a mystical writer, that what one is speaking about there is a knowing by union, by participation, not by distancing. Sometimes these very things are mentioned as an identity of subject and object. It sounds slightly more impersonal, but it's trying to say the same thing. And certainly in the Indian context, this is regarded the supreme identity, that you know something from inside, or to use slightly more classical terminology, then you know the suchness of things. That's somewhat of a Buddhist mode of speaking. But philosophically, Immanuel Kant would say, this is the only way you can know the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. But otherwise our knowledge, including all our scientific knowledge, introduces categories from the mind. Something is introduced by the object, something is introduced by the mind. Therefore, this knowledge is always indirect. And somewhat true to his Christian heritage, therefore he says to really know the noumenon, to know the Ding an sich, one has to have faith. This is not the general Indian answer to these things. One needs to have a different kind of knowledge, which we might say gnosis, if you like. But it is important to understand that these enterprises can, even in principle, not be against each other. If one is engaged with any of them sincerely, one would see that there is not a scientist alive who is not sometimes concerned about what happens to them after death, or what is the meaning or purpose of their life. Whenever one is concerned with this kind of inquiry, even fleetingly, one is naturally then raising philosophical, spiritual, religious questions. Similarly, whenever anybody looks at the plants or the stars or the animals and sees a certain pattern in them, in a way one is doing a proto-science. One is not doing a systematic science, but any look at nature or natural phenomena, natural object, that is the beginning of all science. Naturally, very few people, and this has always been the case throughout human history, let me remind you, only very few people, percentage-wise, are ever free enough from their requirement of mere survival to be engaged with any of this kind of inquiry. Most of the time, we are really just driven by just ordinary demands of existence, or, which may seem rather strange, but also driven not only by the demands of existence, but the demands of wanting to be better than the other guy. Or more important, not better would be not so bad, but to be more important than the other guy, or wealthier than the other person, more powerful than the other person. That force is a very great driving force. So, returning, these two enterprises, really, strictly speaking, have an overlapping domains of inquiry. There is nothing to prevent our great poets, great mystics, also to have a direct intuitive knowledge of natural phenomena. To imagine that Wordsworth didn't understand anything about nature, to claim that he came to know truth, is really to impoverish our notion of truth. William Blake, who regarded Newton and Locke and Bacon as an infernal trinity, this is his term, not mine. He used to say, Newton and reason are yet two things. For him, reason, which he always spelled with a capital R, included imagination, included intuitive understanding. So, for him it was quite clear that Newton and reason are yet two things. Now, writing he was doing, when he was writing, it was more or less soon after Newton. I'm sure writing today, he would probably say much the same about our contemporary sciences. Because the fundamental methodology that I am speaking about, of course, great revolutions in science have taken place. In physics, which is my domain, I can more easily speak about it. Revolutions in quantum mechanics and general relativity, etc. These are all revolutions within science. The really significant revolution is the 16th to 17th century revolution, which was not a revolution within science, it was a revolution that established science, or at least modern science. It was a revolution literally in philosophy, in the way of going about it. What would be called science? What kind of questions can be answered? Or what answers will be acceptable? So it's very important to keep this in mind. Otherwise, one gets excessively carried away by modern revolutions. Modern revolutions are also remarkable and wonderful, have quite amazing thing to say. But they are all still within science. They are not creating a fundamentally new domain of inquiry, which was actually being done in the revolution. That is more or less, it more or less began with the publication of Copernicus's book, De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium. It actually introduced in our language a different meaning of the word revolution. For him, it simply meant rotation of the planets. But for us now, because of his work, it means revolution, not only just a rotation. In fact, that has become a secondary meaning. For us, revolution now means a great upheaval. From then, until the publication of Newton's Principia, or to give you the full title, Principia Mathematica Philosophia Naturalis, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, 1687. So, this whole period, 1543 to 1687, is really the formative period of this great scientific revolution, in which what kind of questions will be considered scientific, what sort of answers will be acceptable, and which are just outside the domain, all that was established during that time. Now, since then, there have been slight decorations here, there. So quantum mechanics revolution and the relativity revolution are not quite as enormous in their implications as the first one that I've been speaking about. And it is during that time several things were established. One of them, I'll focus on 2 or 3 things here because time always has a tendency to run away. One was, what are the primary qualities of reality? And what are essentially secondary? Clearly, being good guys, they want to attend to primary qualities. That's, after all, closer to reality. Now, this always surprises people coming from music or painting or anything else, that the primary qualities that were settled upon were mass, length, and later on charge was added, nearly a century later, as one of the primary qualities. Color is not a primary quality. To ask what is the purpose of this, that is not even a secondary quality. That's just out of the ballpark. All reality must be reduced to mass, length, and time. These are the primary qualities. Now, to be sure, just for the sake of completeness, charge was added later on, and in our relatively very contemporary times, only in the last 20-odd years, we have 1 or 2 other primary qualities, especially arising from quantum mechanics, like charm. That would require a whole different description to say. These are properties arising in quantum mechanics. Everything else is secondary. And the implication of that was that everything else is subjective. That's not the real constituent of reality. I should tell you here, throughout the history of modern physics, by which I really mean post-Galilean. I mean, after all, Archimedes was also doing physics, Pythagoras was also doing physics, but they had a different style, different assumptions. Post-Galilean physics gradually established this idea. What are the primary qualities? What are secondary? And the secondary qualities were, as it were, subjective. They depended on the person who was looking at them. Therefore, they were not part of objective reality. Throughout this whole development, every major artist and poet in the Western world, most of this development took place in Europe, so it's good to just stay with that for the time being. Every major poet and artist objected to this. You can name any. Blake, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, Goethe, everybody. This seemed to them to be an impoverishment of nature. However, the ship of physics, because of its enormous successes, just proceeded, in spite of the thrashings of these big fish all around, it just proceeded. This is the reason why Blake was saying that this is a satanic or infernal trinity. Satanic also, he used the word. And because it impoverishes what we are investigating. And of course, it is naturally much more successful closer and closer we are to inanimate objects. But Because of this enormous success, the same method, same style was also applied to everything else. Biology, psychology, even sociology. People try to apply this directly, exactly similar propositions and theorems to societies, to anthropology, studying other cultures. What is the program, underlying program? To explain everything in terms of dead matter in motion in reaction to purposeless forces. I will repeat this sentence so that we are clear what is taking place. Everything, even in psychology, that we must explain all psychic phenomena, whether it is of love or great mystical experiences, that it must all be explained in terms of some material particles in the brain, in motion, in reaction to purposeless forces or external stimuli in the case of psychology. The same thing in physics. Physics has been the queen of the sciences since Galileo onwards. Everybody in any science whatsoever wishes to mold themselves in the image of physics. You can do a PhD in physics without ever taking a single course in biology or psychology or anything, but you cannot do it the other way. I'm an unfortunate example of this myself. But what we need to come back to is not what is the... These are some of the limitations which are self-imposed, which allowed for an enormous amount of progress to be made. Newton in particular, this is Newton's Principia, is an absolutely great masterpiece. In the second edition, he was often being criticized, partly, maybe some of you know all this, so I will quickly go over this. When he introduced the idea of the law of gravitation, that a particle attracts every other particle with a certain precise formula. One of the major criticisms, especially by the Cartesians, was that this is reintroducing occult forces into nature, because there was no mechanical process that could be explained, that could explain this. So this was an introduction of occult forces. And Newton actually tried to defend himself very strongly, but he made a very important philosophical step, and this was actually added only in the second edition of the Principia. He added a whole addendum which says these are the rules of philosophizing in natural philosophy. He, as it were, codified certain rules. One of them, this is the second rule, and that is important for us. Because he was being criticized so much from both sides by the mechanistically oriented scientists, the word scientist came into play much later. This is actually a 19th century word. Before that, just natural philosophers would be the phrase. Even now, some places, including at Cambridge and at Yale University in USA, Department of Physics is called the Department of Natural Philosophy. And he was also being criticized by philosophers that this and this doesn't completely explain the whole structure of the universe or something. That you can always bring, right? Nothing can ever completely explain everything. Newton therefore introduced this idea. This is actually one of the rules of reasoning in nature. He has 3 rules, but this is the second rule added in the second edition of the Principia, that any theory will do until you can provide a better one. This is an amazingly successful tool. Partly because it silences the critics. It's much easier to criticize that it doesn't, after all, explain how do the angels fly, how do the planets move, or whatever. There are millions of things it doesn't explain. So Newton said, that's fine. Give us a better idea. But this has had an enormous impact. On the other hand, most scientists don't actually know that this is our rule of reasoning in natural philosophy, but it was explicitly so stated by Newton. The net result is that really, in a way, any theory will do. It doesn't have to necessarily aim at completing something or having a whole picture or this or that. If you have a better idea, a better theory, so bring it. Meanwhile, therefore, it often ends up resulting in a further subdivision of various subjects of investigation, because within that we can have one little truth that can't be controverted. There is a very strong tendency built right in this rule of reasoning towards analytical sciences. By the way, analytical is used in varieties of ways. So let me take a moment here to say what is the usage of this in physics and mathematics. Analytical essentially means that you can take any object or any motion, anything of investigation, and you can break it down into smaller and smaller components. That is to say, you can analyze this in terms of smaller and smaller component, and their sum together will explain the overall phenomena. And it has what is also called commutation principle. A plus B is equal to B plus A. But now imagine, this can apply to very simple motions, but if A was the death of somebody, B was providing medicine, so if the person dies and then you give medicine, it's a little different from giving medicine and then the person dies, right? But in analytical sciences, these are commutating variables. A plus B is equal to B plus A. This was one of the things which was in trouble in quantum mechanics, because it doesn't quite work there. I don't want to really go into too much technicality here, but if people are interested, I'm always engaged in much of this. We can speak in more detail. Let me come back to one or two very fundamental requirements. One of the glories of science and of physics in particular is an insistence on objectivity, that what we are really interested in are the laws of nature, not the laws of the physicists. What does that mean? To basically not be at all influenced by whether the physicist is in China or in India or in England, or whether he's on top of Mount Everest or at the bottom of the sea, or whether he's tall or short or brown or white. That none of that should make any difference. Right? Therefore, a strong insistence on removing what technically is called the personal equation, which is really to say to remove the person from the equations in physics, so that we can actually come to the laws of nature rather than laws of the English physicist or the Chinese physicist. That the fact that Newton happened to be English doesn't mean that his law of gravitation applies only in England. Now, this is, as I said, one of the reasons for the glory of science. But now consider some of its implications. That not only the location of the person or his movement or motion or anything should make any difference, but the quality of person also shouldn't make any difference. Whether the Buddha is looking at certain pattern of electrons or of the stars, or whether a poor unsuspecting graduate student is looking at it, or these days if you have enough research grant, then you don't even have to have a graduate student. You just program a computer that will look at it. It should make no difference. Try to see the implications of this. That the quality of being of the person is wholly irrelevant to the science they produce. And we have outstanding examples of this. We have extremely loving, sensitive, really spiritual scientists, but we have very vengeful and hating, totally self-occupied, self-centered scientists also. Many of them Nobel Prize winners on both sides. The quality of their science should not depend on the quality of their being. Now, I want to take you by contrast to what is the enterprise in spiritual concerns. There also, there is a search for objectivity, but it comes about entirely differently. First of all, the recognition that the human being, including the feelings, the body, and the mind, sometimes for simplicity one ends up saying the human mind, but I'm including the whole thing here, because our feelings are also organs of perception. They're also organs of knowledge. Otherwise, all art should really just fold up. That human beings are the finest instrument of knowledge, but as we usually are, most of us, we are a pretty dull instrument, because we are self-centered, self-occupied, driven by fear and self-importance. Therefore, the whole attempt in the spiritual enterprise is, first of all, to keep the person absolutely in the center of the enterprise, not removing the person. Spiritual concerns have no meaning if the person is not there. And then, what is the further undertaking? The undertaking is to so attempt to refine the inner nature of the person that his personal idiosyncrasies, his own shtick, as the Americans say, won't be the relevant thing. Generally speaking, it gets labeled the ego, so that there is a progressive freedom from the ego. We have technical words for it. In Buddhism, for example, it's called akinchan, self-knotting. In the general Christian tradition, it would be referred to as self-surrender. We have this classical expression of Christ, unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. It's the Gospel of John. Everywhere, this is the concern of the spiritual traditions. It is the refining of the quality of the person, not the elimination of the person, but the elimination of the merely personal idiosyncratic aspects. So the search for objectivity there also, but it is an objectivity by the removal of the, to use Einstein's phrase, the removal of the merely personal. And there is no meaning to anybody being spiritually developed unless it is reflected in the enhancement of compassion, humility, love, and associated other characteristics, including a sense of oneness with the others, a sense of conscience, and a sense of wonder about things. All this is part and parcel of being human, but unfortunately, all the things I just mentioned, if you are impartial enough to look at yourself, nobody here is alien to these feelings of love, compassion, wonder. But take last 1 week. How many moments did you have of wonder, of gratitude, of compassion? This is what the spiritual traditions are aiming at to develop. Not that it is wholly absent in all of us, but most adults it is largely absent. Just because that is not the concern of our education, or one shouldn't be that general. As far as I know, for example, in the Steiner schools, there is much emphasis on trying to develop some of these things. So these things are, it's not that nobody has ever considered these matters, but precisely whenever there is a concern for the spiritual dimension of life, this is where these things are attended to. Development or order in the interior nature. This is an important point also. Sciences are, in general, interested in describing the patterns, the laws in the external nature, but as these things exist. Spiritual practice, on the other hand, is actually trying to bring about an order which is not the default position of the human beings. It does not already always exist that we live in compassion and gratitude and wonder and a sense of oneness. That therefore what they are trying to do is to develop things which are usually absent. In a way, they are trying to create an order which doesn't always exist. To put it slightly more simply, every great spiritual master, including Christ, Buddha, Krishna, you can name any, has said that human beings in general do not live the way they should. But also they add, and that is really a distinguishing feature of religious statements rather than, otherwise they'll be more like scientific statements. To say that people don't live the way they should is a perfectly legitimate scientific statement. But their interest also is that they could, that it could be different. To put it, I'm trying always to have not the lowest common denominator in the spiritual traditions, but hoping for the highest common denominator, which is always difficult. But to put it slightly more concretely so that the things don't become completely abstract, a Christian might say, in general, people live in sin, but they could live in the grace of God. A Buddhist might say, people live in sleep, they could wake up. A Vedantist might say, they live in illusion, but they could live in reality. Right? Each tradition has a different way of expressing it, but in general, they all say, we do not live the way we should, and furthermore, we could. To say, for example, that human beings are mortal would be a perfectly legitimate scientific statement. Nothing so revolutionary to make a statement like this. But that is not, that itself doesn't become a religious statement. For it to become a spiritually oriented statement, one of course begins with the way it now is. Therefore, science is always relevant to any spiritual enterprise. Whatever we understand about the cosmos is a good thing. But the interest there is not simply that human beings are mortal, but then the interest is there anything in us that never dies? And search for that. Then it becomes a spiritual concern. So, I would really be happy to have an exchange. I could say many more things. This whole area is so vast. And if you actually spend some time in it, you can find most sublime considerations and the most asinine considerations. This field is really just right, partly because it interests everybody. It is of human concern. And precisely because of that, many things sell which are just total nonsense. So, I would be happy to address any questions, inquiries, comments you have. I'll stand up as the need arises. Please.
Can I just say thank you for some wonderful, wonderful thoughts.
Oh.
I am a scientist, I'm actually a chemist.
You're a chemist. Well, wonderful. Some of my best friends are scientists.
So I would just like to ask you one thing about the primary qualities of science when it was first developed. Where does velocity fit into it?
No, velocity is the change of position in time.
Right.
So that, therefore, you could take it like this, but basically the time, length or the whole dimension of space, and mass, these will be the primary qualities. But then how fast the mass moves in time, a certain distance, that gives you the velocity.
Yes, because without velocity, not a lot happens.
Sure. But if you wish to pursue these matters much more in detail, much of the discussion of the primary secondary qualities actually took place largely between Galileo and Kepler. These are the two major scientists of that time. And if you wish to follow more sort of philosophical details of this, a book by Burt, B-U-R-T-T, an American philosopher, The Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Science. That will be. And there is a Dutch historian of science, Dijksterhuis, called The Mechanization of the World Picture. That's the title of the book. So these two will help. Okay. Quelqu'un autre? Sorry, somebody else. You speak French?
Yes.
Oh. Yes, sir.
I'm very interested in this field of the consciousness, and you just come from a consciousness cafe, and I'm sure that these kind of questions are asked. But what is your view on the physics of consciousness? That is, do you think consciousness is, I put it like this, a force to be reckoned with? Or is it just a phenomenon that we've dreamed up for the God? You know, they talk about God consciousness, and I remember your talk before, you were talking about the God land, which I'm quite fascinated with, the pineal gland. And this related to consciousness, that's in my view anyway. And I mean, there's several books now. One of a friend of mine by David Ash on the physics of consciousness. But what's your view on this?
Well, assuming we have only a short amount of time. No, first of all, let me actually give you my prophecy about what is likely to happen in the next perhaps 30, 40 years. There is going to be another very great revolution in science, not only in science, but really in the, if you like, in the domain of ideas, so that there will be a new kind of science. Because what has happened since the 16th, 17th century revolution, physics has been the driving force, which, if one had more time to develop this, really essentially means that matter is primary. Everything else is an epiphenomenon. Certain combination of material particles ended up producing life, then certain further complexity ended up producing intelligence, then some further complexity, especially people who were soft-headed, ended up having notions of the spirit, etc. That is the general that is the general scientific description of what actually took place. And my own impression is that the next really major revolution is going to make physics a branch of psychology. But not psychology of the rat running kind of psychology, or the pigeon feeding kind of psychology, but psyche is the Greek word which literally throughout the New Testament is translated as soul. That's not what most of our psychologists are studying. In fact, you use the word consciousness. It is a happy enough phrase. It is neutral enough that academics can use it. All they really are trying to say is spirit or soul by all this. But that makes them too religious sounding, so they don't use this terminology. Now, consciousness is a force to be reckoned with, as you said. But right away, there is an enormous difference in even the usage of this word, consciousness. For example, in the general Indian tradition, I use the word general simply because each of these traditions is very large. You can find a great deal of variety everywhere. But general Indian tradition usage of this word and usage of this word in the Western thought is quite different. And the trouble is, the same word is used partly because everybody is obliged to speak English. But as a friend of mine has repeatedly said, everybody speaks English in their own mother tongue. And same words get used, but they mean something quite different. Let me take consciousness as the particular example here. In the Western world, generally, it refers to contents of consciousness. In India, generally, it refers to the structure, not the contents. For example, to give a very simple example right away, if I have bad thoughts, hateful thought, vengeance, to acquire good thoughts or compassion, let's say, that would be a good thing. But that's not what would be regarded as change of consciousness from an Indian point of view. If all thought can be transcended, that is a structural change. That it's not that the same mind or the same person has now different thoughts. No, it's a different person. It's closer to a species mutation, which is exactly what yoga and any of the other spiritual disciplines actually aim at. This always comes as a bit of a surprise to people, which actually last night, were you there at this Consciousness Cafe? I gave this, the reverse examples are easier because they are more frequent. If somebody suddenly comes up here with some weapon creating great terror, our digestion can change. Some people would wet their pants. Some people's hair will get gray. We know that any of these experiences physiologically change us, but we don't recognize the other side of it. Any great insights, any moments of love, of compassion, also physiologically change us. Our breathing changes, our digestion changes. It is that kind of structural change is what I'm speaking about. So, consciousness is a very large area. Exactly even what we mean by this is a problem. But one shouldn't be hopeless about it. I mean, people are making efforts, trying to clarify it. How else are we going to go about it?
Well, I've met you before, Ravi. I don't know whether you remember me, but some years ago I met you and we discussed some of these things.
Well, since you came again, it's a great compliment,
right.
I think.
And I wrote a book called Psychology with a Soul. And so this whole subject fascinates me now, and what I want to ask you, and I've wondered all the time, is what is it like to be a professor in both physics and religion or spirituality? I don't know whether you see those two as connected, but it seems like you do. I mean,
They're
it's
connected like
something-
love and marriage.
Yes, that's right.
They can exist together or separately.
Yeah. But it's something about that. It strikes me in the work that I've done that in the West we stick to one thing out of a pair of opposites. I am good, you are bad, and that kind of opposition is present in much of our culture. But in the East, there's this possibility of saying both and, that we are both spiritual and we are searching for knowledge, and they may represent different parts of our brain, but the two are both equal realities. And I just want, this is what you must have lived with all this time, of being able to ride those two, and I just wondered whether you'd like to talk about that.
Oh, I'll say a little bit about it. First of all, I have actually myself felt this strongly, and some of my good friends have told me that the reason I actually survived in the university was because people just assumed, oh, he's from India, he's a little weird in any case. So therefore I could do some of these things without anybody worried about it. That it would be harder actually for a regular Western looking guy to do some of these things because the expectations are different. We're just expected to be somewhat out of left field. But it is a very strange situation. This actually was less in the religion department. I also had, for a few years, I had an office in the philosophy department and also in the physics department. The general attitude or a kind of a shared assumption in the philosophy department, in the faculty room, when people would just chit-chatting, or a lovely French word, bavardage, in bavardage. Then they would just assume that these science guys are just really pretty drone-like people. They just keep changing one little parameter here, there, and make more measurements and keep publishing more and more papers, and so they have hundreds of papers after their names, but there is nothing creative about any of this. They are not engaged with any great ideas. And then I would go to the physics department, and there in the faculty room, it was a complete conviction that all these humanity types, they have really no research, no nothing. They just sort of, especially in the summertime, they're sitting around at the Riviera reading dirty novels. You see what our assumptions are. So I was occasionally moving from the Riviera to being a drone, back and forth. No, it's partly what you say. There is somehow a conviction. But I should also say, this may seem strange, some of it is actually required. I know as a professor in physics, for example, whenever we got a fresh group of students, it was really an intentional program on our part as faculty members to try to persuade them that the only avenue to truth is physics. Even any of the other sciences are not in the running. Because unless they can be so hoodwinked, they don't put their best energy. So it's like an athletic training. You have to really convince this athlete that this is the only sport that matters. It's a matter of national pride or whatever is relevant to be brought there. So, of course, then there is the allurement where you go for the Nobel Prize, and our university will be outstanding, and of course, all that. I mean, whatever can be brought. But I see more and more, I guess the older I get, I feel somewhat compassionate even to this kind of ridiculous point of view, because you see where it comes from. Otherwise, people don't do their best. But the tragedy is that you begin to really believe this, and that this is the only avenue to truth. And of course, we have, especially anybody growing up, particularly really in the Christian tradition, could hardly escape this point of view. It's part of the dogma. Everybody else is going to hell except the Christians. So it just gets further transferred to every other undertaking like this. But I sometimes remind my Christian friends, especially in the 10th century, when there was a break between the Eastern and the Western Christian churches, the Pope, of course, condemned the patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and so they were all going to go to hell, and the patriarch returned the favor by condemning them. So the other side is all going to hell as well. So only a few good guys.
So how do you hold them both? Is it easier in Canada? In India?
No, actually, one thing which you said, it's hard to be very exact about it, but too much precision in such matters is not helpful. Our psyche actually has multivalenced movement. Since you are a psychologist, you would probably agree with me. When we see something with our eyes, I give only an external example, it's quite different from putting a flashlight on some area. You have the overall picture, you see the relationship of one object with another, even though everything is slightly hazy, but you have an overall picture. And my impression is that actually the human mind can simultaneously work, not only can, it does, at several different levels, metaphorical, logical, symbolic, etc. But I think part of our education can encourage this multi-leveled, simultaneous operation, or it can discourage it. Too much emphasis on analytical, logical thinking discourages this. So I think that it's not so much to do with Indian and European, but really more to do with what culturally gets encouraged or discouraged.
The aspect of competition, the person competing with others, and you mentioned it earlier, and in a way what you've been saying, I feel, touches on this. Do you think, certainly it's very prevalent in the West, is it also prevalent in the East, and if so, does that imply that it's meant to be a natural tendency, or is it purely cultural? Eddie Einstein had something to say about this and wanted schools to teach pupils to compete with themselves, not with other people. You could see lots of weaknesses, which might be obvious to some people, but if you're bottom, then you lose heart. If you're top, become arrogant, and then you're shattered when you find someone better than you outside in a particular skill. So he wanted to encourage this, apparently, people to compete themselves to help society together. But maybe it's in the West, in the East, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, first of all, certainly speaking about India, there is really an extreme amount of competitiveness, often arising from really sheer survival. It is obvious to everybody that India is a whole economy based essentially on poverty rather than on riches. Therefore, the competition for getting good jobs and therefore the corresponding studies, etc. When I was a relatively young man, just finishing high school, it was just assumed. In fact, nobody in my family ever said that, but among my fellow students and in the neighborhood, it was just assumed. If you are a good student, you would go into engineering. Not because you are interested in engineering, but you will go into engineering just because that's where you can get better jobs. And then, of course, within engineering, there were some institutes which were upper class and then the rest. And so you would try to go to them. This is how I myself ended up doing a Master of Technology in oil exploration. I could have been rich. But just because that's what one did if you were a good student. But obviously that wasn't satisfactory for me. So gradually I shifted to, if you like, purer physics, and then philosophy, then religion. I don't know what I'll do when I grow up. This is an open question. And no, but competitiveness is very deep there. But whether it is deeply in the culture overall is hard to be so sure of. But maybe the contrast I have noticed is more actually in Japan, where the competitiveness is a kind of a group competitiveness. Quite different from its version in India, or what I notice in the Western world. But if you are, as it were, taken out of the group, it's like really being excommunicated somehow. It's a very strong feeling of a group. Somebody here may be more familiar with the Japanese culture. I've been there several times, and this is my impression. But competitiveness is really quite natural. Hegel, obviously well-known Western philosopher, in fact made this statement: every ego in the universe is in competition with every other ego. And the root of this really is whether evolutionary, maybe territoriality, competition for just food, which of course nowadays, as I said, in India may take the form of jobs, but it really ultimately boils down to the same thing: food, competition for resources, or especially food. But then we have other competition for prestige, going for the Nobel Prize, this and that. And I have the impression strongly that it is inevitable, as long as one remains convinced, which is the default position of everybody, that I am separate from the others, the separate self. One of the great Upanishads actually makes this remark: as long as there is a self, there is selfishness. So competitiveness is a feature of that. Not selfishness necessarily in a particularly nefarious form, but in the form that I am, first of all, number one. That what's in it for me, that kind of attitude. So I think it is our default position. Otherwise, all of these great spiritual masters would not have to constantly keep reminding us that this is really the source of our suffering. That's what the Buddha said. That's what practically all the great teachers say, that the source of our suffering is selfishness. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about your prophecy of a revolution in psychology. I think that's what you said, something like that.
I should actually, first of all, give you another word, because psychology has been co-opted. Pneumonology.
Do you see that manifesting in the political world, where it intersects?
Yes, I think you look at the history of any culture, different aspects in it, for example, science, art, music, politics, they are not absolutely at the same time in sync with each other, but fairly soon they come closer and closer to the same overarching principles. You can see this in the history of art and the history of science actually quite closely. But I think it is difficult to say whether the time gap for these styles of human living, what is the time gap for them to come close to each other? It used to be, generally speaking, about 30 to 50 years, but everything seems to be accelerating, so one might imagine there will be much less now. But sooner or later, yes, they do come together. After all, we shouldn't forget that politicians are, first of all, human beings. Sometimes one wonders, but yes.
Yesterday you talked about difference between Western and Eastern philosophy or religion in terms of a different way of knowing, or a different way of looking at knowledge, and you were talking about a kind of seeing, knowledge in the sense of seeing and in the sense of observing. And I was wondering if there's a certain structure to this kind of observation, and if you could talk more about it, like for example, Griffith's phenomenology, or if there's a certain way how this observation happens.
First of all, that particular emphasis is not so much a differentiation between East and West. If we wish to just temporarily to make a distinction, it is really a distinction between a more spiritual or more inner look at things rather than external, which proceeds by separation. Maybe some of you have already heard me say this several times, especially people who are taking this course here. There is only one remark of Christ, or among very few in any case, which can be found in all the 4 canonical Gospels. And that remark is also in Prophet Isaiah and one letter of St. Paul. You have eyes, but you do not see. You have ears, but you do not hear. Therefore, unless one just wants to dismiss these kind of remarks, one would obviously be inclined to then say that there is a different kind of perception which is being spoken about, which is not just ordinary physical eyes. And the development of that perception, or the phrase which is more frequently used, cleansing of perception or deepening of insight, we end up saying. You know, there is outsight, there is sight, there is insight. And outsight just has the ordinary external eyes. Insight is really looking at oneself, if you like, more and more impartially. But then that look can be brought to anybody else. It's not only to me. Therefore, this interior looking can be on so-called external objects. It's the mode of looking that is interior. And it has an impartiality to it. But more importantly, in the cultivation of that sort of attention, the emphasis is towards more and more freedom from fear and from me, self-importance. And that to the degree one can become freer and freer of these, then one can have more and more impartial look at the other person without trying to manipulate them. All manipulation is really a violation of the other person. If you don't mind these kinds of words, but always remembering there is subtlety of these, this is really the only form of love. To look at somebody without controlling them, without manipulating them, etc. To just see. Now, this is nothing really to do with the East or the West. Let me just give you this example directly. This is Wittgenstein, hardly an Eastern philosopher, who said, don't think, look. Exactly the same remark made by Krishnamurti in a different context. Don't think, look.
So I don't know if there is one last question. that might be a very good place to stop talking about love and how it spans science and spirituality and East and West.
If you don't mind, I was just actually going to say that when we speak about cleansing of perception, especially in England, I'm reminded of William Blake, the poem which many people know here. To see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower. To hold infinity in your hand and eternity in an hour. But you see, that requires cleansing of perception, which is all what the spiritual enterprise is about. Thank you.